The gaslights of the Covent Garden colonnade hissed, casting a jaundiced glow on the damp cobblestones. For Lady Genevieve Ainsworth, the sound was a mocking whisper, echoing the gossip that had followed her since her father's ruinous death. She stood, a solitary figure in mourning grey, just beyond the crush of carriages and the vibrant spill of silks and jewels from the Royal Opera House. She possessed a ticket, a single humble admission to the upper gallery, purchased with the last of her pin money. It was an indulgence she could ill afford, but the thought of an evening entirely confined to the suffocating quiet of their rented rooms, with only her own anxieties for company, was unbearable. Inside, society was a glittering constellation. Here, in the public entrance, she was merely a moth drawn to a flame she could no longer approach. She watched them alight from their carriages, the booming laughter of lords, the tinkling chimes of debutantes, the regal sweeps of dowagers in their velvets and furs. Each one was a painful reminder of the world she had lost, a world of private boxes, of knowing nods and familiar smiles. Now she received only furtive glances, the quick, pitying turn of a head, or worse, the cold, deliberate cut. The Ainsworth name, once respectable, was now irrevocably tarnished by debt and disgrace. Her gloved fingers tightened on her worn reticule. Within it lay the opera glasses that had belonged to her mother. It was a foolish thing to have brought, a relic from a life that felt as distant as a foreign land. She had come tonight not for the spectacle on the stage, but for the memory of what it felt like to belong, to hear the swell of the orchestra, and for a few hours to forget that her younger sister Ilara was at home, bravely mending a gown that should have been replaced seasons ago, and that the landlord's threatening letter sat on the mantelpiece like a death sentence. A carriage, blacker than a raven's wing and drawn by four magnificent, perfectly matched greys, pulled to a stop before the grand entrance. The gaslight caught the ducal crest on the door, a snarling wolf's head, and a hush fell over the immediate crowd. The footman, clad in severe silver and black livery, opened the door with a practiced flourish. From the opulent darkness emerged Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood. Genevieve felt a collective intake of breath around her, and her own heart gave a strange, unwilling lurch. He was a man carved from winter itself, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair as black as his carriage, and a face of stark, handsome angles that seemed to hold no warmth at all. His reputation preceded him like a frost, a recluse since the tragic death of his first wife years ago. He was a figure of immense power and wealth, spoken of only in hushed, speculative tones. The Wolf of Blackwood, they called him, a man who devoured hope and felt nothing. He moved with an unnerving economy of motion, his presence sucking the very air from his surroundings. His gaze, a startlingly pale grey, swept over the throng with an expression of profound disinterest. A king observing insects. Then, for a reason Genevieve could not fathom, his eyes stopped. They stopped on her. She felt the heat of a blush crawl up her neck, a mortifying wave of exposure. He was not looking at her with pity or disdain or even curiosity. It was a look of cold, analytical assessment, as if he were measuring a piece of property. For a long, silent moment, the entire world seemed to shrink to the space between them. The cacophony of London faded, replaced by the frantic beat of her own pulse against her ribs. She wanted to look away, to shrink back into the shadows, but some stubborn Ainsworth pride, the last vestige of her former life, compelled her to hold his gaze. She lifted her chin, her expression a mask of calm dignity she was far from feeling. A flicker of something, surprise, interest, crossed his features before it was extinguished. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to the man beside him, a solicitor by the look of his sober dress, and then without another glance he ascended the steps and vanished into the gilded heart of the opera house. The moment was broken. The crowd surged forward again, and Genevieve was jostled, her brief, strange encounter dissolving like a dream. Shaken, she made her way to the gallery stairs, her cheeks still burning. The climb was long and steep, the air growing warmer and more crowded with each landing. By the time she found her seat, a hard wooden bench with a partially obstructed view, the overture had begun. She tried to lose herself in the music, but her mind was a tempest. The Duke's stare had unsettled her more than any of the whispers or cold shoulders. It had been an intrusion, a violation of the careful anonymity she tried to cultivate. She felt as though he had seen straight through her threadbare gown and her practiced composure, right down to the bone-deep desperation that was her constant companion. During the first interval, the gallery emptied as people sought air or refreshments. Genevieve remained seated, knowing she had nothing to spend. She pulled out her mother's opera glasses and focused them on the grand tier below. It was a form of self-torture, observing the world that had cast her out. She saw Lady Danbury preening in her box, her diamonds like captured stars. She saw Lord Ashworth, who had once declared his undying affection for her, now laughing with the Harrington heiress, And then her focus drifted to the ducal box at the center. The Duke of Blackwood stood alone at the railing, a stark figure against the crimson velvet. He was not speaking to anyone. He was simply watching the crowd, his expression unreadable. As if sensing her gaze, he lifted his head, his eyes scanning the upper reaches of the theater. Genevieve froze, the opera glasses feeling heavy as lead in her hands. His gaze swept past her, then returned, locking onto her with an unnerving precision. He held her stare for 3 long heartbeats, then turned and spoke to the same solicitor who had been with him earlier. The man nodded and immediately left the box, disappearing into the corridor. A prickle of unease traced its way down Genevieve's spine. What had that been? A warning? A dismissal? She lowered the glasses, her hands trembling slightly. Perhaps it was time to leave. This had been a mistake. The music could not drown out the reality of her life. It only served to amplify it. She was gathering her shawl when a figure appeared at the end of her row. It was the Duke's solicitor. He moved with an apologetic air, murmuring to the others on the bench as he made his way toward her. "Lady Genevieve Ainsworth," he asked, his voice low and professional. Genevieve's heart hammered against her ribs. "Yes? His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood, requests the honor of your presence in his box." The words were so preposterous, so utterly outside the realm of possibility, that for a moment she thought she had misheard. The few people remaining in the gallery were now staring openly, a summons from the Wolf of Blackwood himself delivered to a disgraced lady in the cheap seats. It was the stuff of scandalous novels. "There must be some mistake," she whispered, her voice tight. "There is no mistake, my lady," the solicitor assured her, his expression impassive. "His Grace was quite specific. He said," the man cleared his throat, as if recalling the exact peculiar phrasing, "the lady in grey, the one with defiance in her eyes. He awaits you," he gestured back the way he had come, "if you would be so kind as to follow me." Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to flee. Nothing good could come of this. The Duke was a predator, and she was wounded prey. But then she thought of Elara, of the eviction notice, of the gnawing, endless worry. What did she have left to lose? Her reputation was already in tatters. Her pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. With a deep, steadying breath she stood. The solicitor's neutral expression did not change, but she saw a flicker of respect in his eyes. She followed him out of the gallery, leaving the whispers and stares behind, descending from the heavens of the poor to the gilded cage of the powerful, each step carrying her closer to an unknown fate. The corridor outside the ducal box was hushed, the plush carpet swallowing the sound of her footsteps. The solicitor opened the door and stood aside, announcing her with a simple, "Lady Genevieve Ainsworth, Your Grace." She stepped inside. The box was a small, opulent room of crimson and gold. The Duke of Blackwood stood by the window overlooking the street, his back to her. He did not turn. "Leave us, Mr. Finch," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the enclosed space. The door clicked shut, leaving Genevieve alone with him. The air crackled with a silent, heavy tension. She waited, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The sounds of the theater, the distant murmur of the crowd, the tuning of violins, seemed a world away. Finally he turned. Up close his presence was even more overwhelming. He was all sharp lines and shadows, his pale eyes seeming to absorb the light rather than reflect it. "Lady Genevieve," he began, his tone devoid of any social pleasantry. It was the voice of a man accustomed to command, for whom conversation was a tool, not a pleasure. "I will not waste your time with artifice. I have observed you, not just tonight. My solicitor has made inquiries. I am aware of your circumstances." Genevieve stiffened, the bluntness of his words a physical blow. "Your Grace, if you have brought me here to mock my family's misfortune, I have no interest in mockery," he cut her off, his gaze sharp and intense. "I have an interest in solutions. You are the daughter of Viscount Ainsworth. You are well-bred, educated, and by all accounts possessed of a quiet dignity that seems impervious to public opinion. You are also in desperate need of funds and protection." Each statement was a cold, hard fact, laid out like items in an inventory. She felt herself being dissected, catalogued. "What is it you want?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He moved from the window to stand before her, close enough that she could see the fine weave of his black waistcoat, smell the faint, clean scent of starch and winter air. "I require a duchess." The words hung in the air between them, stark and unbelievable. Genevieve could only stare at him, her mind struggling to process the enormity of his statement. "A duchess?" she echoed, her voice a faint whisper. "Yes," he said, his expression unchanging. "I have a daughter. She requires a mother. My household requires a mistress. My title requires an heir." I require a wife who will perform these duties with grace and efficiency, and who will not trouble me with demands for affection or sentiment. It will be a marriage in name and function only." He paused, his pale eyes boring into hers, searching for any sign of weakness, of the romantic foolishness he clearly despised. "In return," he continued, his voice dropping to a lower, more resonant pitch, "I will settle your late father's debts in their entirety. I will provide a generous settlement for your sister, enough to ensure her a comfortable life and a respectable match. You will have the protection of my name, the use of my fortune, and a position of unimpeachable security. You will want for nothing material. Your duties will be clear: to manage my homes, to be a mother to my child, and to provide me with a son. Our private lives, our hearts, will remain our own. There will be no pretense of love. It will be a contract." Genevieve felt dizzy, the crimson walls of the box seeming to close in on her. This was madness. A man she had never spoken to before tonight was proposing marriage as one might propose a business merger. Cold, practical, utterly devoid of feeling. It was an insult to everything a union between a man and a woman was supposed to be. And yet, Ilara's face swam before her eyes, the pinched look of worry around her mouth, the way she pretended not to be hungry so that Genevieve could eat more, the shame of being turned away by creditors, the terror of the future. The Duke was offering her a lifeline, a cold, heavy, iron chain of a lifeline, but one that would pull her and her sister from the drowning depths of poverty. "Your child," she managed to say, her throat dry. "You have a daughter?" The fact was not widely known. The Duke's private life was a fortress. "I do. Her name is Rosalie. She is 7. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. A shadow of pain so fleeting she might have imagined it. "Her current caretaker is unsuitable for the long term. Rosalie needs a mother's guidance, a gentle hand." A gentle hand. He spoke the words as if they were a foreign concept. He was looking at her, truly looking at her, and in his gaze she saw not a request but a demand. He had chosen her for her quiet strength, her resilience. He believed she could perform this role. The bell chimed, signaling the end of the interval. The sound was a jarring intrusion. "I do not require an immediate answer," the Duke said, his tone returning to its former clipped efficiency. "But I do not suffer indecision well. My solicitor, Mr. Finch, will call upon you tomorrow at noon. He will have the papers, a preliminary settlement for your consideration. You will give him your answer then." He stepped back, a clear dismissal. He had said all he intended to say. The transaction was proposed. The next move was hers. Genevieve felt a strange sense of calm descend upon her. The chaos of her emotions receded, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. This was not a choice between happiness and misery. Happiness was not on offer. This was a choice between ruin and survival. "There is no need to wait until tomorrow, Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and firm in the small space. She met his gaze without flinching. "I accept your terms." A muscle twitched in his jaw, the only sign of his surprise. He had expected her to prevaricate, to weep, perhaps even to bargain. He had not expected immediate, unconditional surrender. He nodded slowly, a gesture of finality. "Very well," he said. "Mr. Finch will handle the arrangements. We will be married by special license at the end of the week." He turned back towards the stage where the curtain was rising for the second act. The audience was a dark, rustling sea below them. "You may stay for the remainder of the performance, Lady Genevieve. This is, after all, your box now." The last words were not a kindness, they were a statement of ownership. She had been purchased, and as the first notes of the aria filled the theatre, a soaring lament of lost love and tragic fate, Genevieve stood in the shadows of the ducal box, a prisoner of her own salvation, wondering if she had just saved her family or damned herself. The journey to Blackwood Manor was undertaken in a profound and heavy silence. The ducal carriage, the same one that had delivered him to the opera, was an extension of the Duke himself, luxurious, somber, and utterly cold. Genevieve sat opposite him, her hands folded in the lap of her new travelling dress, a practical dark wool garment chosen by a modiste, dispatched by Mr. Finch, one of the many impersonal arrangements that had defined the past week. They had been married that morning in a stark, joyless ceremony in the Duke's London townhouse, the only witnesses being a grim-faced Mr. Finch and a bewildered, tearful Ilara. Now, as the carriage bore them deeper into the autumnal countryside, the world outside seemed to mirror the desolation in her heart. A thick grey fog pressed against the windows, blurring the landscape into a mournful watercolor of skeletal trees and weeping fields. The rhythmic drumming of the horses' hooves was the only sound, a funereal beat, marking the miles to her new life, her new prison. The Duke had barely spoken a dozen words to her since she had accepted his proposal. He was a master of inhabiting a space without truly being present, his attention seemingly fixed on some distant internal point. He read through a stack of documents from his briefcase, the rustle of paper a sharp, irritating sound in the oppressive quiet. Genevieve watched him from beneath her lashes. She studied the severe line of his jaw, the faint scar that cut through one dark eyebrow, the way his long, elegant fingers held a pen. She searched for some clue to the man within, some crack in the marble facade, but found nothing. He was a fortress, and she was standing outside its locked gates. What kind of life would this be? She was now the Duchess of Blackwood, a title that commanded immense respect and power, yet she felt more powerless than ever. She had traded one form of poverty for another, an emotional destitution that felt vast and terrifying. Her duty, he had said, was to be a mother to his child, Rosalie. The thought of the unknown girl was a small flickering candle in the overwhelming darkness. Perhaps, in caring for the child, she could find some purpose, some small measure of warmth. After hours that stretched into an eternity, the carriage slowed, turning off the main road and passing through a set of immense wrought-iron gates. The snarling wolf's head of the Blackwood crest seemed to leer at her in the fog. They proceeded up a long, winding drive, flanked by ancient gnarled oaks that loomed like silent, disapproving sentinels. And then the house appeared, emerging from the mist like a ghost ship. Blackwood Manor was not a house, it was a geological event. A vast, sprawling edifice of dark grey stone, bristling with Gothic towers, crenellations, and rows of dark, vacant-looking windows. It seemed less built upon the land than grown out of it, a natural extension of the brooding landscape. It was magnificent, intimidating, and utterly devoid of welcome. The carriage crunched to a halt on the gravel drive. A footman materialized from the fog to open the door. The Duke exited first, not waiting for her or offering a hand. He strode up the wide stone steps without a backward glance. Genevieve gathered her skirts and followed, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The great oak doors swung open, and she stepped into the entrance hall. It was a cavernous space, 2 stories high, with a stone-flagged floor and a vaulted, timbered ceiling, from which a massive iron chandelier hung like a sleeping spider. A grand staircase swept upwards into the gloom. The air was cold, still, and smelled of stone, beeswax, and something else. Something like old settled grief. The household staff was assembled in 2 neat, silent rows. They were a sea of black and grey uniforms, their faces impassive, their eyes curious but guarded. At their head stood a severe-looking woman with iron-grey hair pulled into a tight bun. She dipped into a flawless curtsy. "Your Grace," she said, her voice crisp and formal. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor. I am Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper." The Duke gave a curt nod. "Mrs. Davies, this is the Duchess. You will see to her needs and ensure the staff affords her all due respect and obedience. Her authority in this house is second only to my own." The declaration was made in the same tone he might use to describe a new piece of furniture. Mrs. Davies's gaze flickered to Genevieve, a quick, assessing look. "Your Grace," she murmured with another shallower curtsy. Genevieve inclined her head, her voice sounding small in the vast space. "Thank you, Mrs. Davies. I am pleased to make your acquaintance." Before another word could be spoken, a second woman swept down the grand staircase. She was dressed in fashionable, expensive black silk, a stark contrast to the servants' uniforms. She was handsome, with sharp features and the Duke's same dark hair, but her smile was a bright, brittle thing that did not reach her eyes. "Alistair, you have arrived!" she cried, her voice carrying a theatrical note of warmth. She descended the final steps and placed a familiar hand on the Duke's arm. "And this must be our new Duchess. Welcome, my dear. I am Lady Beatrice Maxwell, Alistair's sister-in-law." Genevieve knew of her, of course. Lady Beatrice was the sister of the late Duchess. Society rumor held that she had remained at Blackwood after her sister's death to care for her grieving brother-in-law and his infant child. Paragon of familial devotion, the papers had called her. "Lady Beatrice," Genevieve said, offering a polite nod. "Oh, you must call me Beatrice. We are sisters now, in a manner of speaking," she said, her smile widening as her sharp eyes roamed over Genevieve's simple dress, her plain traveling bonnet, her unadorned hands. It was a look of swift, dismissive appraisal. Genevieve felt like a sparrow being examined by a hawk. "Beatrice," the Duke said, his voice flat. He gently but firmly disengaged his arm. "I trust Rosalie as well." "Of course, she is in the nursery, eagerly awaiting your return," Beatrice trilled. "I have kept her on her schedule. She's just finished her lessons." She turned back to Genevieve, her expression one of solicitous concern. "You must be exhausted from your journey, my dear. The country roads are so trying. I have had the Duchess's suites prepared for you. They are in the East Wing. They have been unaired for some time, but I am sure Mrs. Davies has seen to it that they are comfortable." The mention of the East Wing caused a subtle shift in the atmosphere. A flicker of something passed over Mrs. Davies's face. The other servants seemed to hold their breath. "The East Wing?" the Duke questioned, his voice dangerously quiet. "I gave instructions that the West Wing suites were to be prepared, the ones adjacent to mine?" Beatrice's smile did not falter, but a slight flush rose on her cheeks. "Oh, Alistair, you know how sensitive little Rosalie is to change. The West Wing is so close to the nursery, I thought it best not to disrupt her by having a stranger so near, at least not at first. And besides," her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, "the East Wing was her wing. It felt appropriate, a continuation." A continuation. The implication was clear. Genevieve was merely a placeholder, a successor to the first Duchess, and would be housed in the rooms that had been sealed since her death. A cold dread washed over Genevieve. This was a power play, a deliberate move by Lady Beatrice to isolate her and put her in her place, the place of a ghost. The Duke's face was like granite. He stared at his sister-in-law for a long, silent moment. The tension in the hall was thick enough to cut with a knife. Genevieve watched him, waiting to see how he would respond to this subtle but direct challenge to his authority, to the instructions he had given regarding his new wife. "No," he said finally, the word like the crack of a whip. He turned to the housekeeper. "Mrs. Davies, you will have the Duchess's belongings moved to the West Wing suite immediately. Have fires lit. See that every comfort is provided." "Yes, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, relief evident in her voice. Beatrice's face tightened, the brittle smile finally cracking. "Alistair, I truly think—" "I do not," he interrupted, his voice leaving. "No room for argument. The matter is settled." He then turned and addressed Genevieve, though his eyes looked through her rather than at her. "Mrs. Davies will show you to your rooms. I have work in my study. We will dine at 8. Without another word, he strode away, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor before being swallowed by the silence of a long, dark corridor. He had defended his order, but not her. He had asserted his authority, not her position. The distinction was chillingly clear. Lady Beatrice watched him go, a venomous look in her eyes, before she turned back to Genevieve, her charming mask back in place. "Well," she said with a light false laugh, "the Duke has spoken. He can be so particular. Do not take it to heart. He is a man of deep and unchanging habit. It is one of the things one must learn to manage." She patted Genevieve's arm in a gesture of feigned camaraderie. "I am sure we will get along splendidly. I do so want what is best for this family, especially for my darling niece Rosalie." The possessive way she said, "my darling niece," sent another chill down Genevieve's spine. It was a claim and a warning. Lady Beatrice Maxwell was not a devoted aunt. She was the acting queen of this cold, dark castle, and she had just met the usurper. "This way, Your Grace," Mrs. Davies said, her voice a welcome, grounding presence. Genevieve followed the housekeeper up the grand staircase, leaving Lady Beatrice standing at the bottom, a smiling silken serpent in the heart of Blackwood Manor. As they ascended, Genevieve glanced back. Beatrice was still watching her, her smile gone, her expression one of pure, calculating malice. The fog outside was nothing compared to the cold that was seeping into Genevieve's bones. The truce in this house was not merely cold, it was treacherous. The West Wing suite was a series of large, handsome rooms, but like the rest of the manor, they suffered from a profound and melancholy stillness. The furniture was shrouded in dust covers, the air thick with the scent of disuse. Mrs. Davies moved with quiet efficiency, directing maids to pull back the heavy velvet curtains, light the fires in the grates, and unpack Genevieve's meager belongings, which looked pitifully out of place in the cavernous wardrobes. "If there is anything you require, Your Grace, you need only ring," the housekeeper said, her formal demeanor betraying a hint of sympathy. "Thank you, Mrs. Davies," Genevieve replied. "Could you tell me, where is the nursery?" "It is at the end of this hall, Your Grace. Lady Beatrice is likely with Lady Rosalie now for her afternoon reading." Genevieve nodded, her heart giving a nervous flutter. She was a duchess, a wife, and now a mother. It was time to meet her daughter. After the maids had finished and she was alone, she smoothed the skirts of her dress and walked the length of the carpeted hallway. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the newly lit fires in the rooms she passed. She found the nursery door slightly ajar and paused outside, her hand hovering over the cool brass knob. She could hear Lady Beatrice's voice from within, artificially sweet and lilting. "And so the clever little rabbit escaped the clutches of the big bad wolf. Isn't that a lovely story, darling? It shows us that we must be very careful of strangers who pretend to be kind. The small, hesitant voice replied, so soft it was almost inaudible. Yes, Aunt Beatrice. Genevieve's hand tightened into a fist. The story was no accident. It was a poisoned dart aimed at her before she had even entered the room. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The nursery was a large, airy room, but a somber one. The toys were arranged on shelves with a rigid, unplayed with neatness. The walls were a pale, cheerless grey. Lady Beatrice sat in a wing-back chair by the fire, a book in her lap. Curled on a stool at her feet was a small, slight girl with the Duke's black hair and a pale, serious face. She had wide, watchful eyes, the color of a stormy sea, that immediately fixed on Genevieve with a look of startled apprehension. This was Rosalie. "Ah, Duchess," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with false surprise. "We were not expecting you. Rosalie and I were just finishing our story." Genevieve's gaze went to the child. "Hello, Rosalie," she said softly, her voice gentle. "I am Genevieve." Rosalie shrank back, her eyes darting to her aunt for guidance. She said nothing, merely clutching a small, worn-looking stuffed rabbit to her chest. "She is a little shy," Beatrice supplied smoothly, closing the book. "Her sensibilities are very delicate. She is not accustomed to new people." The words were an indictment of Genevieve's very presence. Ignoring Beatrice, Genevieve took a step further into the room and crouched down so she was closer to the child's level. "That is a very handsome rabbit," she said, her smile warm and genuine. "Does he have a name?" Rosalie stared at her, her small mouth a tight line. She clutched the rabbit tighter and shook her head, a barely perceptible movement. "Of course he has a name," Beatrice interjected with a light laugh. "His name is Captain. My sister, Rosalie's dear mother, gave him to her. He is a very precious keepsake." Another reminder, another way of marking territory. Everything in this house, even a child's toy, was a monument to the sainted first Duchess. Genevieve felt a surge of frustration, but she forced it down, refusing to let Beatrice see any reaction. Her focus was on the silent, frightened child. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Rosalie," Genevieve said, still speaking directly to the girl. "And you too, Captain." She rose to her feet. "I will leave you to your reading. I look forward to seeing you at dinner, Rosalie." She turned and left the room, her heart aching. The child was not just shy, she was terrified, and Lady Beatrice was her keeper, carefully tending to the child's fear, cultivating it like a rare and poisonous flower. The challenge before Genevieve was far greater than she had imagined. It was not simply a matter of running a household or providing an heir. It was a battle for a child's soul, a quiet, undeclared war to be fought in the shadowy corridors of Blackwood Manor. Over the next few weeks, Genevieve learned the rhythms of her new life. They were rhythms of silence and solitude. She took her meals with the Duke and, on occasion, Lady Beatrice and Rosalie. These were stiff, formal affairs. The Duke ate with a focused intensity, rarely speaking. Lady Beatrice filled the silence with a constant stream of bright, meaningless chatter, much of it subtly designed to undermine Genevieve, highlighting her ignorance of the estate's traditions or the late Duchess's preferences. Genevieve learned to weather these small attacks with a calm, unruffled exterior that gave her adversary no satisfaction. She spent her days exploring the vast labyrinthine manor. She discovered a magnificent library, its shelves groaning with books, but its hearth always cold. She found a ballroom where the furniture was draped in white sheets, like a congregation of ghosts. The house was a mausoleum, a monument to a past that its master refused to let go of, or perhaps was held captive by. The east wing, she discovered, was indeed kept locked. When she asked Mrs. Davies for the key, the housekeeper grew flustered. "Lady Beatrice keeps the key, Your Grace. She says His Grace wishes it to remain undisturbed." Genevieve did not press the issue, but she filed the information away. Another locked door, both literal and metaphorical. Her attempts to connect with Rosalie were met with a persistent, heartbreaking wall of silence. The child was a constant shadow at Beatrice's side. Whenever Genevieve tried to speak to her, Rosalie would look to her aunt, who would answer for her with a cloying smile. "Rosalie is feeling quiet today," or "Rosalie prefers to play by herself." Genevieve brought her gifts, a beautiful picture book, a set of drawing pencils, which were accepted with a silent, fearful nod and then were never seen again. One rainy afternoon, driven by a need for air, she put on a heavy cloak and walked out into the grounds. The formal gardens near the house were impeccably maintained, but they were rigid and severe, all sharp angles and colorless shrubbery. She wandered further, following a crumbling stone path half swallowed by weeds, until she came upon a high, ivy-choked brick wall with a heavy iron-bound wooden door set into it. The door was rusted shut. Her curiosity piqued. She pushed with all her might. The hinges groaned in protest, but the door swung inward, revealing what lay beyond. It was a garden, or the ghost of one. It was enclosed on all four sides by the high walls. a secret forgotten world. A sundial, green with moss, stood at the center of what had once been intersecting paths, now almost lost to overgrown grass. Stone benches were collapsing under the weight of ivy. And everywhere, roses, not the prim, tidy bushes of the formal gardens, but a wild, tangled thicket of them, their thorny branches reaching for the grey sky like desperate arms. They were ancient, neglected, but here and there a few stubborn, pale pink blossoms clung to the canes, their delicate scent a whisper of lost beauty in the damp air. It was a place of profound sadness, but also of profound potential, a heart that had been left to run wild with grief. Standing there amidst the beautiful decay, Genevieve felt a sense of purpose stir within her for the first time since her arrival. This, she thought, was something she could do. This was a piece of Blackwood she could heal. That evening at dinner, she broke the customary silence. "Your Grace," she said, addressing the Duke directly, "I came across the old walled garden today, the one behind the yew hedge." The Duke froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. His face, usually a mask of indifference, became utterly, terrifyingly blank. Beside him, Lady Beatrice drew a sharp, audible breath. "It is in a state of neglect," Genevieve continued, her voice steady despite the sudden glacial drop in temperature. "I would like your permission to restore it." "Absolutely not," Beatrice snapped, her voice sharp as glass. "That garden it is a memorial. It is to be left as it is." The Duke said nothing. He placed his fork down with deliberate precision and stared at Genevieve, his pale eyes like chips of ice. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. She felt as though she had trespassed on sacred ground, spoken a blasphemy. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Genevieve met his gaze without flinching. "Because it is a shame to see something that was once beautiful left to die. Because there is still life in it. It only needs tending." She was speaking of the garden, but they all knew she was speaking of something more. She was challenging the suffocating stasis of the house, the worship of a sorrowful past. She was offering to let in the light. The Duke continued to stare at her, his expression unreadable. She saw a flicker of something in the depths of his eyes, a storm of emotions he kept brutally suppressed. He was weighing her words, her audacity. He looked from her to Beatrice, whose face was a mask of furious disapproval, and then back again. "Very well," he said, the words dropping into the silence like stones into a deep well. "You may have the garden." He picked up his fork and resumed eating as if nothing had happened. Beatrice looked as though she had been struck. She opened her mouth to protest, but a single warning glance from the Duke silenced her. For the first time, Genevieve had won a battle. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. He had given her permission. He had given her a key of a sort. As she looked out the window at the rain-lashing darkness, she felt a fragile, tentative shoot of hope. She had a project. She had a purpose. In the heart of Blackwood's neglect, she would cultivate a garden. The work began the next morning. Genevieve, armed with a pair of thick gardening gloves and a set of shears she'd procured from a bemused head gardener, entered the walled garden as if stepping into another world. The place became her sanctuary. For hours each day she knelt in the damp earth, her mourning gowns protected by a sturdy apron, and methodically began to untangle the chaos. She started with the roses, learning their language of thorn and bloom. She pruned away the dead wood, cleared the choking weeds from their bases, and gently tied the healthy canes to the crumbling brick walls. It was hard, often painful work. Her hands became scratched and calloused, her muscles ached at the end of each day, but it was a satisfying pain. With every severed branch of dead wood, she felt as if she were clearing away some of the suffocating grief that clung to the manor. At first the staff watched her with a mixture of pity and suspicion, the Duchess scrabbling in the dirt like a common labourer. But as the days turned into weeks and the garden began to reveal its underlying structure of paths and beds, their expressions softened to a quiet respect. Mrs. Davies began leaving a flask of hot tea for her on a newly scrubbed stone bench. The head gardener, a taciturn man named Mr. Thorne, started appearing with offerings: a barrow of well-rotted manure, a collection of terracotta pots, a bundle of stakes. He never spoke much, merely grunting, "Thought you might have a use for these, Your Grace," but his approval was unmistakable. The Duke remained a distant, silent observer. Genevieve would sometimes feel his presence, a flicker of movement in an upper window overlooking the garden, but he never approached, never spoke of it. His permission had been the beginning and the end of his involvement. And yet she felt his eyes on her. She felt his silent witness to her patient, steady transformation of the neglected space. Her efforts with Rosalie were less immediately rewarding, but she applied the same patient philosophy. She did not force conversation or affection. Instead, she simply created opportunities for connection. She learned from Mrs. Davies that Rosalie loved sweet buns, so she spent an afternoon in the kitchens and, with the cook's guidance, baked a batch herself. She left them on a plate outside the nursery door with a simple note, "For Rosalie and Captain." The next day, the plate was empty. She began to spend time in the library, not reading, but sketching the birds she saw. From the window, she left her sketchbook and pencils on a low table. After a few days, she entered the library to find a new, childish drawing on a fresh page, a wobbly rendering of a rabbit. It was a silent conversation, a fragile bridge being built across a chasm of fear. Lady Beatrice watched these developments with a tightening coil of resentment. She saw her influence, so carefully cultivated over years of whispered warnings and suffocating care, beginning to wane. She doubled her efforts, keeping Rosalie closer than ever, filling her head with stories of her sainted mother, the first Duchess, whose memory Genevieve was supposedly desecrating with her every action. One bright, crisp afternoon, Genevieve was in the garden, humming to herself as she staked a particularly lovely climbing rose, its blossoms the color of a faint blush. She heard a small sound and turned to see Rosalie standing in the open doorway, half hidden behind the heavy wood. The child clutched Captain the Rabbit in one hand and watched her, her wide grey eyes filled with a fearful curiosity. Genevieve's heart leaped, but she kept her movements slow and calm. "Hello, Rosalie," she said softly, offering a warm smile. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" Rosalie said nothing, but she didn't run. She took a hesitant step into the garden, her gaze sweeping over the newly cleared paths, the neatly pruned rose bushes, the burgeoning order emerging from the chaos. "I was just helping this Rose," Genevieve continued in a gentle conversational tone. "She wants to climb the wall to get more sunshine, but she needs a little help to hold on." She finished tying a piece of twine. "There, that's better." Rosalie took another step, her eyes fixed on a pale pink blossom near Genevieve's hand. "Would you like to touch it?" Genevieve asked. "You have to be very gentle." Slowly, hesitantly, Rosalie reached out a small hand and brushed her fingertips against the velvety petals. A look of wonder dawned on her face. "It's soft," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was the first word she had ever spoken directly to Genevieve. The sound was sweeter than any bird song. "Yes, it is," Genevieve said, her own voice thick with emotion. "Roses can be strong and thorny, but they are also very soft and beautiful." At that moment, the tranquil scene was shattered. "Rosalie, what are you doing? Come away from there at once." Lady Beatrice stood in the doorway, her face a mask of cold fury. She strode into the garden, her silk dress rustling angrily, and snatched Rosalie's hand. "You know you are not to come in here. This place is not for you." Rosalie flinched, her face crumpling in fear. "She was doing no harm, Beatrice," Genevieve said, her voice firm as she rose to her feet. "This was my sister's garden," Beatrice hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You have no right to be in here digging it up like a commoner, and you have no right to bring this child here to fill her head with whatever you are filling it with." "I am restoring it," Genevieve said, her calm a stark contrast to Beatrice's agitation. "And Rosalie is my daughter now. I have every right to spend time with her." "You are nothing!" Beatrice spat, her carefully constructed facade finally crumbling to reveal the raw ambition and jealousy beneath. "You are a placeholder, a vessel for an heir. You will never replace her. Alistair will never care for you. He is bound to her memory, and I am the guardian of that memory." "Aunt Beatrice, you're hurting my arm," Rosalie whimpered, tears welling in her eyes. Beatrice seemed to realize she had gone too far. She loosened her grip, but her eyes, locked on Genevieve, burned with hatred. "Stay away from her," she warned, before turning and pulling Rosalie from the garden, the child stumbling to keep up. Genevieve was left standing alone, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. The battle was no longer a quiet one. War had been declared. But as she looked at the single perfect rose Rosalie had touched, she felt not fear, but a surge of resolve. She was not just fighting for a place in this house, she was fighting for a child. Later that evening, as she was dressing for dinner, a maid delivered a small folded piece of paper. There was no envelope. Unfolding it, she found the shaky, childish drawing of a single rose. Her victory in the garden had been short-lived, but Rosalie's message was clear. An alliance had been formed. The Duke must have noticed something was amiss. At dinner that night, the atmosphere was more strained than usual. Beatrice was brittle and silent, while Genevieve was quietly preoccupied. Rosalie, who had been permitted to dine with them, did not touch her food and kept her eyes fixed on her plate. The Duke observed them all, his gaze moving from one face to the next, a deep line creasing his brow. After the meal, as they were preparing to withdraw, he spoke. "Genevieve, a word in my study." It was not a request. Lady Beatrice shot her a look of triumph, clearly believing Genevieve was about to be reprimanded for upsetting the delicate balance of the household. Genevieve followed the Duke down the long corridor to his private domain. The study was the heart of the Duke's world. It was a deeply masculine room, paneled in dark wood, dominated by a massive desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. A fire roared in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the leather-bound spines. It was the only truly warm and lived-in room she'd seen in the entire manor. He did not invite her to sit. He went to stand before the fire, his back to her. "Lady Beatrice informs me there was an incident in the garden today." "There was," Genevieve confirmed, her voice even. "She objected to my speaking with Rosalie." He turned to face her, his expression grim. "She claims you are attempting to erase the memory of her sister." "And what do you believe, Your Grace?" Genevieve asked, her chin held high. She would not be cowed. She would not defend herself against such a ridiculous accusation. He studied her for a long moment, his pale eyes seeming to pierce through her defenses. "My beliefs are irrelevant," he said, his voice low. "What matters is the effect on my daughter. She has been withdrawn since her mother's death. Beatrice's care, while constant, seems to have encouraged that withdrawal. Since your arrival, there have been changes. I have seen them." Genevieve's heart skipped a beat. He had been watching, more closely than she had realized. "She drew a picture of a bird," he said, almost to himself. "She has not drawn anything in years." He looked at Genevieve, and for the first time, she saw not the cold Duke, but a troubled father. "Beatrice said the garden was a memorial. Is that what it was?" "It was a place of beauty that had been abandoned to grief," Genevieve replied softly. "I am not erasing a memory. I am clearing away the weeds so that the memory can breathe, so that new life can grow alongside it." He considered her words, his gaze distant. He looked at the fire, at the dancing flames that cast his stern features in a warm, flickering light. He seemed to be wrestling with a decision, a conflict that ran deeper than a simple squabble between his wife and his sister-in-law. "Continue your work," he said finally, his voice rough with some unspoken emotion. "In the garden, and with Rosalie. I will speak to Beatrice." It was more than a victory. It was a vote of confidence, a transfer of trust. He was choosing her, her methods, her quiet patience over Beatrice's years of suffocating control. He was giving her his child. As she turned to leave the study, her heart swelling with a strange, unfamiliar hope, her eyes fell upon a small silver-framed portrait on the corner of his desk. It was turned away, facing the wall. Overcome with curiosity, she paused. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Duke's face shuttered, the brief glimpse of the father replaced once more by the cold, remote master of the house. "It is no one," he said, his voice flat and final. "Good night, Duchess." The dismissal was absolute. She had been granted access to his daughter and his garden, but the door to his own heart remained firmly, irrevocably locked. She left the study, the image of the turned-away portrait burned into her mind, a symbol of the central mystery of the man she had married. He had given her a glimmer of trust, a fragile alliance, but the walls around his own past were higher and thicker than any in his forgotten garden. The Duke's conversation with Lady Beatrice must have been effective, for her overt hostilities ceased. It was replaced by something far more insidious. A campaign of passive, saccharine sabotage. She no longer forbade Rosalie from speaking to Genevieve, but she was always there, a smiling, watchful presence, ready to twist a simple conversation into something fraught with hidden meaning. If Genevieve suggested a walk, Beatrice would remark how her dear sister had adored walking on that very path, often weeping with melancholy. If Genevieve read a story, Beatrice would recall how the late Duchess had preferred a different, more morally instructive tale. She wielded memory like a weapon, constantly positioning Genevieve as an inadequate and unwelcome replacement. Despite this, the bond between Genevieve and Rosalie deepened, nurtured in stolen moments and silent exchanges. It grew in the shared task of pressing flowers found in the garden, in the quiet companionship of sketching by the library fire, in the way Rosalie began to seek Genevieve's eyes for reassurance when her aunt's presence became too oppressive. The garden, too, flourished under Genevieve's care. The roses, freed from weeds and decay, began to produce a riot of new, healthy growth. Mr. Thorne, now a staunch, if silent ally, helped her plant lavender and foxgloves along the restored paths. The space was transforming from a graveyard into a sanctuary, a place of vibrant, living color. One afternoon, as a late autumn sun cast long shadows across the lawn, Genevieve was in the garden, showing Rosalie how to gather seeds from the dried heads of poppies. Rosalie, her face alight with concentration, was carefully tapping the seeds into a small envelope. The sound of her soft, happy humming was a miracle in the quiet air. Genevieve felt a presence, and looked up to see the Duke standing in the doorway. He did not enter, but simply watched them, his usual stern expression softened by something she couldn't quite decipher. It might have been wonder. "Papa!" Rosalie cried, spotting him. She ran to him, holding up her envelope. "Look, we are saving the flower babies for next year!" The Duke crouched down, a gesture so uncharacteristically gentle it made Genevieve's breath catch. He looked at the envelope in Rosalie's hand, then his gaze lifted to meet Genevieve's over the child's head. In his eyes she saw a flicker of something she had never seen before. Gratitude. It was a brief, unguarded moment, a silent acknowledgement of the life she was coaxing back into his home, into his child. He didn't say a word, but the look was more eloquent than any speech. He simply placed a hand on his daughter's head, a gesture of profound paternal love, before straightening up and walking away. That single, shared glance felt like a turning point. A quiet warmth spread through Genevieve's chest, a feeling so foreign and yet so welcome she held it close like a precious secret. For the first time, she felt not like the Duchess, the contractor, or the placeholder, but like a partner. The fragile peace was shattered a week later. The anniversary of the first Duchess's death descended upon the manor like a shroud. The servants spoke in whispers, their faces grim. Lady Beatrice dressed in the deepest mourning and moved through the house like a tragic priestess, ensuring the sorrowful occasion was properly observed. The Duke retreated completely. He locked himself in his study, refusing meals, speaking to no one. The brief warmth Genevieve had seen in him was gone, replaced by a chilling, impenetrable darkness. The entire house seemed to hold its breath, caught in the grip of his silent, overwhelming grief. Beatrice seized the opportunity. She found Genevieve in the library, her expression one of deep, sorrowful concern. "My dear Duchess," she began, her voice a theatrical whisper, "I feel I must speak to you, for Alistair's sake. He is in such a state, as he always is at this time." She gestured for Genevieve to sit. "He would never tell you this himself, but your activities have been deeply troubling to him, especially now. This garden you have so radically altered," she sighed, dabbing a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. "It was his last gift to my sister. He designed it for her, to see it changed, to see her roses pruned and other commoner flowers planted. It is like a knife in his heart, a desecration of her memory." The words were a cold shock. Had she been wrong all along? Had her attempts to bring life back to the garden only caused him more pain? Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced her newfound confidence. "And poor Rosalie," Beatrice continued, her voice trembling with false emotion. "You have been kind, I know, but you encourage her to forget, to move on. But a child must not forget her mother. It is a sacred bond. Alistair sees her smiling with you in that changed garden, and it tears him apart. He feels as though you are conspiring to erase his first family, the family he truly loved." Every word was a carefully aimed blow, designed to cripple and confuse. Genevieve felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Had she misread everything? Was the gratitude she'd seen in his eyes merely a mask for a deeper agony? "He is a man of profound loyalty," Beatrice concluded, rising to her feet. "He would never break his word to you, but his heart will always be buried with my sister. I only tell you this so you might understand the delicate nature of your position here." She swept out of the room, leaving Genevieve reeling in a sea of uncertainty and guilt. That night, a storm broke. Wind howled around the stone walls of the manor, and rain lashed against the window panes. The weather was a perfect mirror for the turmoil in Genevieve's soul. She could not sleep. Beatrice's words echoed in her mind. Had she been cruel in her clumsy attempts at healing? A sudden sharp cry cut through the sound of the storm. It was a child's cry of distress. Genevieve threw on a dressing gown and rushed from her room, her heart pounding. She ran down the hall to the nursery. The door was open, and a lamp was lit inside. Rosalie was sitting up in bed, her face flushed, her breathing ragged and shallow. Mrs. Davies was beside her, trying to soothe her. "What is it?" Genevieve cried, rushing to the bedside. She placed a hand on the child's forehead. It was burning hot. "A fever, Your Grace. It came on so suddenly," the housekeeper said, her face etched with worry. "I've sent a stable boy for Dr. Harding, but with this storm it could be hours." Rosalie began to cough, a harsh, croupy sound that tore at Genevieve's heart. She looked around the room. "Where is Lady Beatrice?" "She is indisposed, Your Grace," Mrs. Davies said, her lips tightening. "A sick headache. She said the sound of coughing was too much for her nerves." Rage, fierce and hot, surged through Genevieve, burning away her doubt and guilt. Beatrice's concern for the family was a complete and utter sham. At the first sign of real crisis, of unpleasant, messy reality, she retreated to her chambers. "Bring me cool water, cloths and a basin," Genevieve commanded, her voice steady and clear. And tell the kitchen to keep broth warming on the stove." She sat on the edge of the bed and gathered the trembling child into her arms, murmuring soft, soothing words, stroking her hair. Rosalie leaned against her, her small body radiating a frightening heat. For the rest of the night, Genevieve did not leave the child's side. She bathed her forehead, coaxed sips of water between her lips, and held her through terrifying fits of coughing. Mrs. Davies and a young maid assisted, their earlier deference replaced by a deep, unspoken respect. Sometime in the darkest hours before dawn, the nursery door creaked open. The Duke stood there, his face haggard, his clothes disheveled. He looked as though he had been through his own private storm. His eyes, hollowed out with grief and lack of sleep, took in the scene. The basin of water, the scattered cloths, and his wife, sitting on his daughter's bed, cradling her with a tenderness that was both fierce and gentle. He said nothing, simply came to the other side of the bed and placed a hand on Rosalie's cheek. His touch was hesitant, almost fearful. "Her fever is high," Genevieve said, her voice rough with exhaustion. "We are doing all we can until the doctor arrives." He looked at her then, truly looked at her. He saw the weariness in her eyes, the genuine love and concern on her face. He saw her strength, her steadfastness. And in that moment, he must have also seen the lie in Beatrice's carefully constructed narrative. This was not the action of a woman trying to erase his family. This was the action of a mother protecting her child. He pulled a chair to the bedside and sat. He did not speak, but he did not leave. Together, in the flickering lamplight, surrounded by the howling of the storm, they kept watch over their daughter. A fragile, temporary alliance was forged in the crucible of shared fear, a silent truce between two damaged souls, united by their love for one small, fragile life. The anniversary of a death had been eclipsed by the desperate fight for a life, and in that shared challenge, the foundation of their cold arrangement began to irrevocably crack. Dr. Harding arrived just after dawn, his carriage having battled fallen trees and flooded roads. His diagnosis was grim, a severe inflammation of the lungs. The next 2 days would be critical. He left powders and instructions, but his expression offered little comfort. The outcome rested on the strength of the child's constitution and the quality of her nursing. The manor became a hushed, anxious sickroom. Genevieve refused to leave Rosalie's side, sleeping in a chair by the bed, her own exhaustion a distant hum beneath the sharp focus of her concern. The Duke, to the surprise of the entire household, did the same. He had his meals brought to the nursery on a tray and conducted his estate business from a small desk in the corner. They barely spoke, but their shared purpose created a strange, profound intimacy. They were two soldiers in a trench, bound by a common enemy. Genevieve would bathe Rosalie's face, and he would be there with a fresh cloth. He would hold Rosalie's hand when the coughing fits were at their worst, his large, strong hand engulfing his daughter's, and Genevieve would see a raw, unguarded anguish on his face that squeezed her own heart. Lady Beatrice made a few brief, theatrical appearances, fluttering her hands and speaking of prayer, but the raw, clinical reality of the sick room clearly repulsed her. She could find no purchase for her manipulations in this space of genuine crisis, and quickly retreated, leaving the vigil to them. Her absence was a relief, a poison removed from the air. On the third night, the fever reached its peak. Rosalie was delirious, tossing and turning, muttering fragments of words. Her breathing was a shallow, painful rasp. Dr. Harding had been and gone, his prognosis now in God's hands. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a sky of unnerving, starless clarity. The silence in the house was absolute. Genevieve sat by the bed, wiping a cool cloth over Rosalie's brow, her own body aching with a weariness so deep it felt embedded in her bones. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed pricked at the back of her eyes. The Duke sat opposite, his face a mask of stone, but his hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists on his knees. Sometime after midnight, Rosalie's thrashing stilled. Her breathing, which had been so labored, seemed to stop altogether. For one terrifying eternal second there was only silence. Genevieve's heart stopped with it. Then Rosalie took a long, deep, shuddering breath, and another. Her eyelids fluttered, and she settled into a deep, peaceful sleep. Her skin, which had been burning hot, now felt merely warm and faintly damp. The fever had broken. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped Genevieve's lips. She sagged forward, her head bowing over the child's sleeping form, the tension of the past days draining out of her in a single shuddering wave. A hand landed on her shoulder, large and warm. She looked up through her tears to see the Duke standing over her. His own face was transformed. The granite mask had crumbled, and in his pale eyes she saw a reflection of her own overwhelming relief, and something more, a profound, raw vulnerability. "She will live," he said, his voice thick and hoarse. "You saved her." "We saved her," Genevieve corrected softly. He did not reply. He simply stood there, his hand resting on her shoulder, the physical contact a shocking, intimate anchor in the quiet room. After a long moment, he withdrew his hand and walked to the window, staring out at the dark grounds. "The doctor said I should get some rest," Genevieve whispered, her body finally succumbing to its exhaustion. "Mrs. Davies can sit with her." "I will stay," he said, his back still to her. "Go. Rest." His tone was gentle, an order softened by an unspoken gratitude. Genevieve nodded, though he couldn't see her. She stood, her legs unsteady, and took one last look at the sleeping child. Then she left the nursery, her mind and body numb. She didn't go to her own rooms. On instinct, she went downstairs and out the side door into the cold, clean night air. She walked, her bare feet silent on the damp grass, until she reached the entrance to the walled garden. The moon was high and bright, bathing the garden in an ethereal silver light. The roses, heavy with dew, seemed to glow from within. The air was fragrant with damp earth and lavender. It was a place of peace, of life. She sank onto a cold stone bench, the chills seeping through her dressing gown, and finally let the tears fall, for the fear she had endured, for the relief she now felt. She did not hear him approach. "I thought I might find you here," his voice came from the shadows. She looked up, startled to see him standing by the sundial. He had a heavy cloak thrown over his shoulders. "I could not sleep," he said, walking towards her. He did not sit, but stood before her, a tall, dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. "This garden, Beatrice told me you had destroyed it." "I know," Genevieve said quietly. "She was wrong," he stated, his gaze sweeping over the sleeping flowers. "It is more beautiful than I remembered. It is alive." He looked back at her, his face half in shadow, half in light. "My first wife, Eleonora, this was her place. She loved it, but she was not like you. She did not have your strength. The beauty of this garden was a burden to her. It was a reminder of all the life she felt she could not live." Genevieve listened, her heart pounding, knowing she was on the verge of understanding. This was the story behind the locked wing, the turned-away portrait, the suffocating grief of the house. "Our marriage was an arrangement," he continued, his voice low and strained, the words torn from a place of deep, old pain. "Her family's title for my family's wealth. I thought I could make her happy. I thought providing her with every luxury, with a beautiful home, with this garden, I thought it would be enough. I was a fool. I was cold. I knew nothing of a woman's heart." He began to pace, his steps agitated on the gravel path. She grew more and more withdrawn, melancholy. "I did not see it. I was busy with my duties, with the estate. I thought it was a passing sadness. Beatrice was always here. She told me to leave Eleonora to her moods, that she understood her sister's delicate constitution." He stopped, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. "One year, on the anniversary of our marriage, I found her here, in this garden. She had given up. She had a bottle of laudanum from the physician. She said she could not bear the gilded cage I had built for her. She said I had a heart of ice, that I had frozen her soul." His voice broke on the last words. "She died in my arms, right here where you are sitting. Her last words were an apology for not being strong enough. And Beatrice was the one who found us. She told me it was my fault, that my coldness, my lack of affection, had driven her sister to despair, and I believed her." The confession hung in the cold night air, raw and devastating. Genevieve's own pain was forgotten, eclipsed by the sheer magnitude of his. His coldness was not a failing, it was a penance, a shield built of guilt and self-loathing. For years he had been living in a prison of his own making, with Beatrice as his willing jailer, constantly reminding him of his crime. "It was not your fault," she whispered, the words feeling achingly inadequate. He turned to face her, his face a mask of torment in the moonlight. "Wasn't it? I give my heart, and I destroy. I withhold it, and I destroy. I am poison, Genevieve. To myself, and to anyone foolish enough to get close to me. I married you as a contract to protect you from that. To protect myself, to keep you at a safe distance." "You are not poison," she said, her voice gaining strength. She rose from the bench and went to him, stopping just before him. She looked up into his haunted eyes. "You are a man who has been grieving, a man who was made to believe a terrible lie. Grief is not a poison, Alistair. It is a wound, and wounds can heal if you let them." She reached up and gently, tentatively touched his cheek. His skin was cold, but he did not pull away. He flinched, as if the simple, compassionate touch was a shock to his system. He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping to trace a path down his stone-like face. He was the Duke of Blackwood, the wolf, a man of immense power, but in that moment, in the moonlit garden, he was just a man, broken and lost. And for the first time, Genevieve felt not fear or pity or duty towards him. She felt a deep, aching, and unequivocal love. The revelation was as profound and as terrifying as his own. He leaned into her touch, a silent surrender. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart, battered by the shared crisis over Rosalie, and now breached by his own confession, finally came tumbling down. He opened his eyes, and the ice in them had melted, replaced by a raw, unguarded emotion that mirrored her own. "Genevieve," he whispered her name, his voice ragged. It was the first time he had used it without a title, not as the Duchess, but as her. The space between them vanished. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of passion, but of profound, desperate connection. It was hesitant at first, a question, and then it deepened. A release of years of pent-up grief, guilt, and a loneliness so profound, neither of them had fully understood its depths until this moment. It was the taste of tears and cold night air, of solace and absolution. It was the feel of a soul finding its counterpart in the darkness. When they finally broke apart, they stood breathless in the silver light, the world remade. He did not release her, but held her close, his arms wrapped around her as if she were the only thing holding him together. He buried his face in her hair, and she could feel the tremors that ran through his powerful frame. "I have been living in a ghost story of my own making," he murmured against her ear, "and Beatrice has been turning the pages." "We will write a new story," she whispered back, her hand stroking his back, offering a comfort she never dreamed she would be in a position to give. They stood like that for a long time as the moon began its slow descent, two solitary figures finding refuge in each other. There were no grand declarations, no promises for the future. There was only the quiet, stunning realization that the cold, practical contract they had entered into had, against all odds, been transfigured by shared crisis and painful truth into something real. The first fragile shoots of love were pushing their way through the frozen ground of Blackwood Manor. The next morning, the house felt different. The oppressive weight of grief that had clung to the stones for years seemed to have lifted, replaced by a tentative, fragile sense of hope. Rosalie was sleeping peacefully, her color returned to normal, her breathing easy. Genevieve, after only a few hours of sleep, felt more awake and alive than she had in years. The Duke met her outside the nursery. He looked tired, but the haunted, tormented expression was gone. In its place was a quiet resolve. "Good morning," he said, and the simple greeting was imbued with a new warmth. "Good morning," she replied, a soft smile touching her lips. "I have sent for Lady Beatrice," he said, his tone firm. It is past time she found her own establishment. An hour later they faced her in the main drawing room. Beatrice entered, her expression one of triumphant sympathy, clearly expecting to find them broken by the ordeal and ready to be guided by her steady hand. She stopped short when she saw them standing together by the fireplace, a silent, united front. "Beatrice," the Duke began, his voice calm but unyielding, "your presence here is no longer required. I have instructed Mr. Finch to secure a respectable property for you in Bath. Your belongings will be packed and sent on." Beatrice's jaw dropped, the color drained from her face, leaving behind a mask of disbelief and fury. "What, Alistair, what is the meaning of this? After all I have done for you, for this family?" "You have done a great deal," he said, his voice dropping to an icy calm that was more terrifying than any shout. "You have nurtured my guilt and cultivated my grief. You have used my daughter's love as a tool for your own control. You have attempted to poison my marriage. You have preyed upon my weakness for your own benefit. For that, I am in your debt, a debt I am now repaying by asking you to leave my house permanently." "This is her doing," Beatrice shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Genevieve. This usurper, she has bewitched you." "She has done nothing but show this family a kindness and strength it did not deserve," the Duke stated, moving to stand slightly in front of Genevieve, a subtle, protective gesture that spoke volumes. "She has shown me what it means to heal, something you know nothing about. You will be gone by noon." Beatrice stared at him, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. She saw the absolute finality in his eyes. The game was over. Her reign was at an end. With a strangled sob of pure rage, she turned and stormed from the room. The sound of a door slamming upstairs echoed through the house a moment later. It was a sound of closure. With the toxic influence of Beatrice gone, Blackwood Manor began to breathe again. The change was slow but profound. Laughter was heard in the halls for the first time in years. Rosalie's laughter, as she and Genevieve chased butterflies in the now thriving garden. The Duke began to join them on their walks, at first a silent, watchful presence. But gradually he began to talk. He pointed out different species of trees to Rosalie, told her stories of his own boyhood on the estate. He would direct quiet questions to Genevieve about her own childhood, about her sister Ilara, about the books she was reading. He was courting his own wife. He would appear in the library when she was reading, not with any grand gesture, but with a cup of tea he had poured for her himself. He would seek her out in the garden, his hands tucked behind his back, only to produce a rare botanical print he'd ordered for her from London. They were small, quiet acts of consideration, each one a testament to the new, tender emotion growing between them. The locked east wing was opened. Genevieve, walking with the Duke, found the rooms aired out, the dust covers removed. Eleonora's belongings had been carefully packed away, not in sorrow, but in gentle respect. In their place was a light, airy sitting room. "I thought this could be your own space," Alistair said, his voice hesitant. "For your sketching. The light is good here." Genevieve looked around the room, then at him, her heart full. He was not erasing the past, but making space for the future. For her, she reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers with his. "It's perfect," she said. One evening, a few months later, they sat together in his study. A comfortable silence had settled between them, the kind that exists only between people who are perfectly at ease with one another. Rosalie was asleep upstairs, Ilara was happily settled in a new home in London with a generous dowry, and the world outside the windows of Blackwood Manor was quiet. Alistair rose and went to his desk. He picked up the small, silver-framed portrait that had always been turned to the wall. He looked at it for a long moment before walking over and placing it in Genevieve's hands. The portrait was of a beautiful, impossibly sad-looking young woman with dark hair and haunted eyes. "Eleonora. She deserves to be remembered," Alistair said quietly. "Not as a ghost or a saint, but as who she was, a woman who was lost and in pain. I kept her hidden because I was ashamed of my part in that pain. But you have taught me that hiding from the past doesn't change it." Genevieve looked from the portrait to her husband's face, seeing the peace that had finally settled there. "What you had with her was real," she said softly. "Her pain was real. Your grief was real. And what you and I have is also real. One does not have to negate the other." He took the portrait from her and placed it on the mantelpiece, facing out into the room, a quiet, final act of acceptance. He then came to her and knelt before her chair, taking both of her hands in his. "Genevieve," he began, his voice thick with an emotion that made her own throat tighten. "When I married you, I offered you a contract. I promised you my name, my fortune, my protection. I promised you everything but my heart, because I truly believed I did not have one left to give. I was wrong." He looked up at her, his pale grey eyes, once so cold, now shining with a fierce, unwavering light. "You walked into this house of shadows and you were not afraid. You tended to a neglected garden, a neglected child, and a neglected man. You brought light and life back to all of us. You have shown me what it is to live again, not in the past, but now, with you." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "The terms of our contract are insufficient. They must be renegotiated. I love you, Genevieve. With everything that I am, with all the pieces of my heart that you have so patiently helped me put back together, I love you." Tears streamed down Genevieve's face, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. The love she had felt for him, a love that had grown in silence and shadow, could finally be spoken. "And I love you, Alistair," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I think I have from the very beginning." He rose and drew her to her feet, pulling her into an embrace that was both strong and tender. He was no longer the wolf of Blackwood, a man made of ice and shadows. He was her husband, her partner, her love. The arrangement was over. The marriage had just begun. 1 year later, the late summer sun streamed through the windows of the morning room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The room, once so somber and still, was now filled with the sound of life. Rosalie, now a happy, chattering 8-year-old, sat on the floor, carefully arranging a bouquet of flowers from the garden. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, a perfect echo of her father's expression. Genevieve sat on a chaise longue, a soft shawl around her shoulders, watching her. In a cradle beside her, a baby with a tuft of black hair gurgled in his sleep. Alexander, the new heir of Blackwood, born 2 months prior, was a calm and contented child, a reflection of the newfound peace in his home. The door opened and Alistair entered. He was smiling, a genuine, easy smile that had become as natural to his features as the stern frown once was. He came directly to Genevieve, bending to kiss her softly before peering into the cradle at his son. "He's sleeping again," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet awe that never seemed to fade. "He takes after his father," Genevieve teased gently, serious and contemplative. Alistair chuckled, a rich, warm sound that still made her heart flutter. He sat on the edge of the chaise, taking her hand in his. His gaze was soft, filled with a love so deep and constant, it was like the air she breathed. "Papa, look," Rosalie said, holding up her finished creation. It was a lopsided but cheerful arrangement of roses, lavender, and foxgloves. "For Mamma's room?" It's beautiful, sweetheart, Alistair said, just like your mother. He looked back at Genevieve. I received a letter from your sister this morning. She is ridiculously happy. It seems Lord Ashworth's rival is quite taken with her. She included a sketch he made of her. It's quite good. Genevieve smiled. Ilara's letters were a constant source of joy, filled with the excitement of her London season, a life made possible by the loveless bargain Genevieve had once made. It seemed that bargain had yielded nothing but love in more ways than one. I have something for you, Alistair said, reaching into his pocket. He produced a small velvet-wrapped object. It was a locket, beautifully crafted in silver, in the shape of a rose. He opened it for her. On one side was a miniature portrait of Rosalie and Alexander, their heads close together. On the other, a tiny, exquisitely painted rendering of the walled garden in full bloom. So, you can always keep your garden close to your heart, he said softly. Tears welled in her eyes as she accepted the gift. It was perfect, a symbol of everything she had cultivated here, everything she had healed, a symbol of their family. Later that afternoon, they walked together in the garden, Alistair pushing the pram, Rosalie skipping ahead on the path. The air was warm and smelled of roses and damp earth. The space was a riot of colour, a testament to a year of patient, loving care. They stopped by the stone bench where Alistair had made his confession, where their lives had irrevocably changed. He wrapped an arm around her, drawing her close to his side. Do you remember that night at the opera? He asked, his voice a low murmur against her hair. I saw you standing there alone with all of London society turning its back on you, and you just lifted your chin as if you were the queen and they were the peasants. I knew in that moment that you had a spine of steel. I was terrified, she confessed with a laugh. I know, he said, his smile in his voice. But you didn't let it win. You never do. He paused, looking out over the vibrant flower beds. I made you a cold, calculated offer that night, a business proposition. It was the greatest gamble of my life, and I didn't even know it. And has it been a profitable one, Your Grace? She asked, a playful light in her eyes. He turned to her, his gaze intense and full of love. It has been the saving of me, he said, his voice serious. He leaned down and kissed her, a long, lingering kiss filled with the warmth of the afternoon sun and the promise of 1,000 more days just like this one. Rosalie ran back to them, her hands full of fallen petals. She tossed them into the air, and they rained down on her parents like soft, fragrant confetti. Alistair and Genevieve broke their kiss, laughing, their faces dusted with pink and white. The ghosts of Blackwood Manor had been laid to rest, not by forgetting, but by the relentless, stubborn, and beautiful power of new life and new love. The garden was in full bloom, and so were they. Dear listener, isn't it remarkable how the most desolate of landscapes can hold the seeds of the most beautiful gardens? Genevieve walked into a life that was cold, silent, and bound by the chains of the past. The Duke was a man, imprisoned by his own grief, convinced that his heart was a barren place, incapable of growth. But Genevieve didn't try to shatter the walls around him with force. Instead, she simply began to tend to the ground she was given. She picked up a trowel, she cleared away the weeds, and she patiently, quietly let in the light. So often in our own lives, we encounter hearts that seem closed off, relationships that feel neglected, or situations that appear hopeless. We see the thorns, the decay, the overgrowth of past pains, and we are tempted to walk away. We believe that some things are simply too broken to be fixed. But this story reminds us that healing is not an event, it is a process. It is the quiet, consistent act of showing up, of offering compassion where there is coldness, of nurturing life in the face of despair. It is the courage to see the potential for a rose garden in a tangle of weeds. Perhaps there is a neglected garden in your own life, a relationship, a dream, a part of yourself that you have allowed to fall into disrepair. Don't be discouraged by the silence or the thorns. Pick up your tools, be patient, offer your gentle, steady care. You may discover, as Genevieve did, that the most beautiful and enduring love doesn't always grow in the easy, sunlit patches, but in the forgotten corners where we were brave enough to cultivate hope. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that even the deepest winter eventually gives way to spring.